Join us every Wednesday for InFocus, a weekly talk show produced by the SKNIS Information Service, where we provide exclusives with key persons within the government and discuss pertinent, relevant, and interesting matters that affect us all. Tune in every Wednesday, live on ZIZ Radio and streamed live on Facebook at SKNIS Media and ZIZ Online. InFocus, your government, your business.
I'm Ian Richards. Welcome to InFocus, a weekly program where we zoom in on what's happening within and throughout the government, your government. It's a new day for consumer protection in St. Kitts and Nevis following the passage of the Consumer Protection Bill 2023 in the Federal Parliament on Monday, October 30th, 2023. As the bill now waits to be gazetted to become law, we explore how it will enhance the rights of consumers in St. Kitts and Nevis and also suppliers. Joining us today is Senior Minister and Minister of Consumer Affairs, the Right Honourable Dr. Denzil Douglas, and the Director of the Department of Consumer Affairs, Paul Quealy. They will be supported by Tricia Rollins, Communications Officer within the department. Stay with us as we delve into your government, your business.
The bill is a very good piece of legislation, and so since this bill is trying its utmost to protect all of us as consumers, I will support the bill.
I believe that we are on the right track in terms of a parliament, in terms of what we are doing to address the practical things that need to be addressed here in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, and I wish this bill safe passage.
Thanks for staying with us for InFocus, and let me apologize first off for our late start. But I'm pleased to welcome for the first time here to InFocus the Right Honourable Dr. Denzil Douglas, so welcome.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for having me.
And of course, we've had Mr. Quealy and Ms. Rollins on before, and it's good to have you back as well.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for having us again.
So we want to begin now with the Consumer Affairs Department. Of course, as we would have seen, the bill, the Consumer Protection Bill, was passed in Parliament earlier this week. But we want to first of all delve into the department a bit. So can we talk a bit about how the department is working to ensure that persons are more aware of its presence and what its functions are? So what is the role, would you say, of the Consumer Affairs Department?
Well, before I ask Mr. Quealy to respond appropriately, I'd just like to say that the ministry within which Consumer Affairs falls is the Ministry of International Trade, Industry, Commerce, and Consumer Affairs. So the Consumer Affairs is one department within that ministry. And of course, the director who is responsible for that ministry is Paul Quealy, who is here with us today. And of course, we have Tricia, who also has been within that ministry over the last maybe 12, 15 months, and is now part of this entire decision to bring this new bill for the attention of the people.
Mr. Quealy?
Well, I'll move into the role of the department. In St. Kitts and Nevis, we do not have advocacy groups, consumer advocacy groups, to lobby on behalf of consumers within the marketplace for any infractions that might be happening in the market or any sort of injustice. So with that void, the government of St. Kitts and Nevis would have to step in and fill that void. So the Consumer Affairs Department functions as an advocacy group for consumer interests within the Federation. Under the scope of the department, we ensure that warranties are enforced. They have explicit warranties, which is the warranty card which may come with an item, we ensure that retailers would honor these warranty cards when persons have issues with the products that they purchase. Many times retailers would tell consumers that they can't get a refund, they can't get an exchange, but once you are selling an item and it has this warranty card in it, it had a specified time period in which you could return the item to the store and get a refund or an exchange. And persons should also be aware that once you have this card, you are not responsible for sending this item back to the manufacturer for repair. The person who sold you the item is acting as a middleman on behalf of the person or the wholesaler where they got the item from. So they would be responsible for sending this item back overseas if necessary for repair. And the other type of warranty that we look at is implied warranty, meaning that if you purchase an item, the item should be fit for purpose. And if it is not, you're supposed to get an exchange, a refund, the same way you would get on an explicit warranty. It's just that that item does not actually have a warranty card with it. We also monitor food basket items, government food basket items, to ensure retailers are staying within the markup range, which is specified on SRNO 41, the price control order. Officers from the department from time to time would go into the field and collect price information related to these items, and we would do our necessary calculations in-house to ensure that the prices stay within the required markup ranges. We also interface with the Bureau of Standards. Officers would be dispatched when necessary or required by the Bureau of Standards to assist with the calibration of gas pumps or scales. We ensure that items do not have dual pricing attached to them, meaning when you go to the store, you see two items attached to the item and you do not know which one is the actual price. We try to protect against that as well.
How often, because you just listed a number of things, and I think what really stood out to me is that I think I didn't know, and I'm not sure how many persons would have known in terms of the warranty issue, in the case that if you buy something from a supplier here that comes from overseas, that it is the supplier who is responsible to send it back to whoever they would have gotten it from, because as you mentioned, they're just a middleman. So how often does the department engage with consumers really to inform them of their rights, inform them of these things that they may not be aware of?
Well, on a weekly basis, we issue tips from the department via our Facebook page to sensitize the public on what it is they should really expect when they're in the marketplace, or to point out various areas of concern that consumers may have addressed over time. We call this a consumer corner, and I could specifically point to one instance recently where we gave information about merchants not being able to charge a minimum purchase amount when it comes to debit cards. And we got quite an interaction for that one. So those are the kind of things that we try to do, issuing information to persons on pertinent matters.
Ms. Mullins, you want to break that down a bit in terms of the debit card issue?
We disseminated that information via our Facebook page. And it was because we got numerous complaints from consumers saying when they go to certain stores, they are basically forced to spend a minimum of, let's say, $20 or $25 in order to pay with their debit card. So we did our investigations. We know that was against consumer rights, because you as a consumer, if you don't want to spend a certain amount of money, you shouldn't be forced into buying things that you don't necessarily need or spending money that you don't have. So we did our investigation, and it was noted that this was actually against Visa's policies and regulations. So if a consumer is using their debit card to facilitate payment, they should treat it as cash, because if you swipe a debit card, the money comes off instantly. Now, in the case of a credit card, they can impose a minimum purchase amount. But if it's a debit card, you are infringing upon consumer rights and going against Visa policies when you impose a minimum purchase amount. So we have been in conversation with different banking institutions to have them back what we are saying. And what has happened is those business places that have been complained, we would have found out where did they get their credit card machine from, which bank issued that machine, and then we would report it to the bank. And the bank has assured us that they would deal with it in different ways. They can deal with it. They would issue a warning to them. If it continues, the matter continues, they can remove that credit card machine out of that store. They can even go further by terminating that merchant's business account. So we have been getting a lot of complaints, like Mr. Creeley said, about that same issue, but we also got a lot of feedback, positive feedback, where people are now saying when they go to the stores, they realized that the store is actually taking their debit card now for payments. So if you go into a store and you want to spend $5, you should be able to do so by paying with your debit card. And I know the businesses are frustrated that they have fees they have to pay to the banks because every transaction attracts a fee. We understand that, but that is the cost of doing business. That is a legal fee they are paying to the bank. Basically, that is in their terms and agreement, because as a business owner, you are trying your best to find different ways to get money from the consumers. So if you were a cash-only business, you would lose out on those consumers that have a credit card, a debit card. So that's why they want to have a debit card or a credit card machine within their stores, so they have to pay those fees.
And that's an important distinction to make the difference between a credit card and a debit card. And so that leads me to the next questions then, in terms of how the department engages with businesses, persons who provide the services or who are selling goods.
From time to time, we have sessions with business owners. Recently, in the past month, we had a session with, in collaboration with Tourism Department, where we gave information to merchants from the Port Zante area specifically about what is required of them under the legislation. Because we get a number of complaints from persons who would have visited our shows. They might have purchased, let's say, jewelry. They go overseas and they have it appraised, and then it has a different value as opposed to what it was told to them when they were here. So we have to guard against these sort of issues that could damage the tourism product. So we, as I said, collaborated with Tourism Department, Ministry of Tourism, and we gave the necessary information to them on what is required of them under the law. And many of them, they were receptive of the information. They were not aware of what actually is required of them, to be honest with you. And this is something that I think that we would need to continue going forward. In terms of supermarkets, from time to time, we would interface with the owners of these establishments to let them know that they are required to have prices on the shelves, to try and reduce the amount of expired items that they have in their premises, try to conduct a sale or something to try and get rid of these items before the date actually comes. Outside of that, we usually send out information, as I mentioned previously, via our Facebook page, so everybody would have information to that once it is put there.
Right. Okay, Senior Minister, let me bring you back in now as we talk about the Consumer Protection Bill 2023, which, as we established at the top, was passed on Monday in the Parliament.
Right.
Now, it replaces the Consumer Affairs Act, which was gazetted and published some 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. Why was it necessary to introduce the bill at this time?
Well, firstly, the bill, when it was first introduced 20 years ago, it was in keeping with what we had to do, our obligation as a member of the Caribbean community, and also as a signatory to the revised treaty of Chaguaramas. Specifically, that agreement spoke to in Article 184 and also 185 that we had to provide harmonized consumer protection legislation as all CARICOM countries were expected to do, because we are all signatories. And the bill, therefore, was necessary to fulfill this particular obligation because we had recognized that some consumer protection from 2003 bill were not covered. And it was important, especially after we would have had continuing complaints from our own consumers here in St. Kitts and Nevis, that there was something that we had to do to improve the situation. And that is what the intention was. Of course, this process did not just simply take place overnight. This shortfall in the legislation, I would say, has been recognized for some time. And over the years, the department, together with the governments before and the ministry, would have tasked the legal department, the Attorney General chambers, to bring the legislation up to date and ensure that we would have better protection of consumers. This definitely became one of our important agenda as items as we took over the government, and so we were very pleased that within the first year of our parliamentary sessions, within the first year of taking office in August of last year, we were able to bring this into being because this was so critical for us.
Right, and just some of the things, some interesting aspects of the bill that really stood out to me. During your presentation, you mentioned that the bill discontinues price control officers. Now, that is something that the department has in terms of staff going out and monitoring the prices in the supermarket. Mr. Cooley would have referred to that. So let me ask you then, what is the difference between the post of a price control officer and a consumer protection officer, that's what they're called now, and why was the change necessary?
But first of all, we do not have, I would say, as a post or position in the department, specifically a consumer protection officer. All of them generally are called that. But the idea of the price control officers was something that is out of vogue in the sense that we do not really legislate to control price. We leave the control of prices of goods and services to be one determined by the producer and the consumer. That is the new concept. So, whereas in the years gone by after the Second World War, there was a definitive decision to ensure that certain basic items were provided and obtained by the people. That is not what the situation is today. The situation is to ensure that the price for a good, for a particular type of good, is determined by an arrangement between the consumer and the provider. Now, that is different, of course, from the what we call the basket of goods, which are the essential items that the government is saying. These are the essential items to maintain proper nutrition.
And that would be like flour, milk,
rice, and so forth.
Right.
Chicken, and so forth. These are basic items that are in what we call the essential food basket. Those have specific control on the prices. And as I was illustrating in the parliament, frozen chicken and a set of items, I don't know if you have the list, there's a list of items which we say must be properly controlled in price in order for the ordinary man to be able to survive. The list is how many items?
About 23 items.
You want to speak to it?
Yeah, I would go through the list so persons are aware of what these items are. And it's chicken frozen, meats frozen, fish frozen, meat salted and in brine, like your pig snout, fish salted and in brine, your saltfish, Vienna sausage, cornmeal, dried peas, cereal, butter, margarine, pasta products, cheddar cheese, and when we speak of cheese, we mean the big tin of cheese that you usually cut up into smaller pieces and so. Sardines, tuna and fish, fresh fruits and vegetables, toothpaste, lard and substitutes, cooking oil, rice, toilet paper, medicated soap, like your Dettol soap, powdered detergent, and disposable diapers, adults and for children. And I also want to point out, in this new legislation, Section 98 speaks to management of pricing. And it says, subject to any other law that determines the price of any good or service, a supplier may determine any scoring or other evaluative mechanism or model to be used in managing or pricing goods or services offered by the supplier. So what this is basically saying is that they are free to set their price for their goods or merchandise as long as it is not an item that is under price control restrictions or something along that line. Okay?
In terms of the basket of goods, that's available online. Where can persons find it?
The basket of goods, it was posted on our Facebook page. We do not have an active web page at this moment, but we are currently working on that and working on an app as well. So persons would be able to get up-to-date information about these items when we collect the prices in the supermarket.
Just a suggestion, perhaps it should be pinned to the top so it's easily accessible once somebody visits the Facebook page.
Good suggestion.
Right. Okay, so now the bill also gives authority to officers to remove defective and or expired goods from shelves, independent of support from other ministries. And I think this is something, again, that stands out to me. You know, they don't have to wait for, say, the health department or some other government agency to get involved. The consumer protection officers have the authority now to act independently.
Good. That is critically important because one of the shortcomings in the earlier legislation, this was not explicit at all. In fact, what we have found is that when you look at what is operating at this time, the officer is acting as part of a quasi-court or judicial system. In the past, we simply would take things off the shelves. Today, when this becomes operationalized, soon as it is assented to by the Governor General, the officer can, or he's empowered,
Or she.
They are both empowered to issue something like a ticket and resolve the issue there by determining that this is a particular matter of violation. On the other hand, you would have to wait on the board to make specific determinations on the matter that is brought before the board. But this new piece of legislation, which is absent, I should point out, in similar legislation in St. Lucia and Grenada and St. Vincent, this one here in St. Kitts and Nevis allows the officer to operate as a traffic police officer, issuing summons, if you want, citations, and thus fine the person who is found to be violated. So this is one of the differences that we have in this piece of legislation.
In regards to the expired items, the officers would remove them from the shelves now under the new legislation, and they would be required to be placed in a container, and it would be sealed once we get the appropriate seal, like the kind of tape that customs uses with their logo and stuff on it. You seal the container and you place it in a location where the health department, the health inspectors would then come and confiscate these items, and dispose of them. I see you looking at me kind of weird.
No, not weird, but I'm just picturing it in my mind. So you're saying that the consumer protection officer goes into a supermarket and he sees an expired good. He has that, or she has that authority to take it from the shelves, load it up somewhere, and just go with it, essentially.
No, we're not going to take it from the establishment.
No. What happens?
We place it in a container, a box or something.
So it remains.
It depends on how much items it is. Yeah, it remains at the establishment because we cannot condemn the items. Health department will have to come in, write up the necessary documentation, and issue them the certificate so that they can dispose of the items at the landfill.
That is the important distinction that I was trying to get to, because it's important, because then I would see that it could become a confusion where some person say, oh, well, the officer may be disingenuous and, you know, maybe they have some other use for it. And so that is an important distinction that I think that needed to be made so that persons could understand that it remains on site.
Yeah, we don't take the items from the premises.
No.
And so what is in place, what mechanism in place now for a consumer protection officer? For instance, they go into the supermarket, how do they log assignments, how do they log their finding, how do they report, what mechanism is there to report to the department and the board if necessary?
Well, as it is right now, when the officers conduct their investigations or their field visits, they have, we operating under paper, we need to go digital, but we're using paper for now. So they have these forms that they would write down the items that they have confiscated. It would have on the quantity of each item, the total value of the specific items that they removed. The persons who are the floor supervisors or managers would sign off on the items that were confiscated. And this sheet, a copy of it would be sent to Health Department. Health Department would then know what items were taken from the shelves in which supermarket or whichever establishment, and then they would actually know what it is they're looking for when they go there. A copy of this sheet as well comes back to our office for our records, where we would keep track of which establishments are having this issue in terms of expired items. So we could actually go and create, how should I say it, a report about which establishments are actually prime offenders for having expired items.
I would like to add to that. So Mr. Creeley said that we would create our reports at the office, and the reason for doing these reports is, like Mr. Creeley said, to create a trend, so that in the event that an officer goes and gives a supermarket owner, just saying, a ticket, and they want to question it, we can go back into our reports and look at that same supermarket's history of inspections and determine if that supermarket had been non-compliant for months upon months, and they are just trying to find a way out of a ticket. So the reports are very necessary for the department.
So what happens if they are repeat offenders?
Well, that's where the new legislation comes in, because before, in the past, we have businesses that are constantly non-compliant. And all we can do when we go into these business places, we remove the items, and we always advise the business owners of the deficiencies that we found. And we ask them not to continue or warn them, but we couldn't do anything. Now, with the ability to ticket or issue a citation, we hope this will serve as a deterrence to businesses not following the consumer protection laws. And it doesn't go just towards expired items. You have businesses that are selling items that are not in English labeled. And that is a big health problem, especially when it comes to medication. Because we have had complaints where consumers would say, I bought this medication for a child, and they told me what dosage to give the child. But then when they go to the doctor is asking, how did you know how much to give this child? Because you can't read this. You are actually overdosing your child. So we have had situations like that. So we are trying to curb those type of complaints. So like I said, with the ability to now ticket these businesses, and we are not just trying to make money off of businesses. We are hoping this deterrent would push businesses to be compliant with consumer protection laws.
It's all about safety and health.
Yes.
But here's a question now, in the sense of those sealed containers that remain on site. What happens if they are tampered with, and who's responsible if they are tampered with?
That is a public
Major
health,
violation.
yeah. And also it is a violation under this new legislation now, because it specifically states that you cannot tamper with the seal once it is placed on there. So if we go back and the seal is broken, whoever is in charge of the business is liable for a fine.
Good.
And in terms of the consumer protection officer, now of course, there are other public officers, and we can think of police officers where there's a reporting mechanism for those who may seek to abuse their power. Is there anything in place for businesses who may feel a consumer protection officer may be acting unfairly?
The law speaks to you. The law protects the business person as well. He has the right to challenge.
I can say that, yeah, Dr. Douglas is right. I cannot say that we would be acting unfairly, because we have these sheets, which is evidence of what is expired in your establishment. So to say like we're just coming in there and picking at you, no, we have evidence of what it is we're actually talking about right in front of us.
The importance of the paper trail. Right. Okay, so we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more In Focus. We encourage you, viewers and listeners, to stay with us.
Join us every Wednesday for In Focus, a weekly talk show produced by the St. Kitts Nevis Information Service, where we provide exclusives with key persons within the government and discuss pertinent, relevant, and interesting matters that affect us all. Tune in every Wednesday, live on ZIZ Radio and streamed live on Facebook at SKNIS Media and ZIZ.
The bill also has given us provision for both consumers and suppliers to be heard. And that is what the point I want to make, is the balance that this piece of legislation brings.
Welcome back to In Focus. We continue our discussion with officials from the Department of Consumer Affairs, the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, as they continue to discuss the Consumer Protection Bill 2023 that was passed in the Federal Parliament on Monday. Joining us is the Minister of Consumer Affairs, the Right Honorable Dr. Denzil Douglas, Paul Quilly, who is the Director of Consumer Affairs, the Department, and Tricia Rollins, who is also the Communication Officer there. Now, Dr. Douglas, you mentioned that the bill, of course, is part of a greater strategy of harmonizing laws within OACS and also within CARICOM, of course, as we are a member of both organizations. But you mentioned in your presentation in Parliament that there are some dynamics of St. Kitts and Nevis that are accounted for in this bill.
Right.
What are those?
Right. Specifically, what we just discussed, the original draft of the bill came as a generalized, harmonized piece of legislation. But here in St. Kitts and Nevis, we listened intently to what was coming back from the officers who would have visited the business places and identified the common violations that were observed. So when we put our own piece of legislation together, being given the harmonized, generalized piece of legislation from CARICOM, we made sure that we tailor-make it to St. Kitts and Nevis. These are some of the specific things that we would have observed over a period of time when our officers went out on a daily basis. For example, expired items, they were being placed back on the shelves. I mentioned that in the Parliament. This was a common observation that was made. And we marveled for the reason that were being given. In fact, complaints were that, well, they were taken off the shelves, but the health department people didn't come and condemn them. So that also indicates that we have to work in close, in tandem with the public health officers. And that is why we were able to say earlier that instead of just simply leaving it there for the health officer to finally determine the condemnation, we empowered the officer from the from the Department of Consumer Affairs to resolve certain relatively minor infractions by issuing a ticket.
And so there are those who may argue that in terms of for the persons who regularly offend,
Right.
that the public has a right to know.
Exactly.
So is there a mechanism for that where, and of course it has to be considered very carefully because, you know, the government is not trying to put anybody out of business per se. But again, how do you balance the right of the public to know in terms of perhaps naming a company a service provider who may be a repeat offender,
Right.
as opposed to having just it ticketed and dealing with internally?
Right. I think it's a small country. And although we will not go out to shame and blame anyone.
Name and shame, as I put it,
Right,
yes.
name and shame. We are a small country and people would know. And that is why, apart from trying to shame and blame people, we also tailored the legislation to deal with these common offenses which were recurring. And so I want to point out some of the things that are so specific in this piece of legislation. Goods should be adequately labeled. We insist on that because part of the solution is educating the consumer. So we are saying to the consumer, listen, if you see an item that is not properly labeled, leave it. Because you don't know what you're buying. Leave it. So education becomes critical in this regard. The prices should be affixed to the items being offered for sale.
Every item?
Every single item.
So not on a shelf, the way it is, every item should have.
Every item should be properly priced. You don't wait until you go to the cashier and because you look scrappy, they say, well, that costs this, or because you look wealthy, it costs that. No. The price must be clearly marked on the item before you purchase it.
Yeah, and the consumer has a right to information.
Right.
So that is part of it as well. They're supposed to know how much they would have to pay because you never know how much money is in somebody's pocket.
Exactly.
It has happened to me before,
Right.
but we move on from this.
The expiration dates should be visible on food items, especially food items. Must be visible on food items. Persons should be offered a durable receipt that indicates what was purchased and from which establishment the purchase was made. Sorry about that. So these are things that we have to make sure are in place. The receipt that you are given, it must be proof of the purchase, and it will be needed in the event that there has to be further investigation into the matter.
And the receipt should have the item, it should have where it was bought the time. It must be detailed, not something general.
Right.
That's an important distinction as well.
Because this is important if you have to return the item. The receipt becomes very, very critical. So again, we are emphasizing on education of the consumer. Remember, we are in a new form of what we call liberalization of trade markets. We are not forcing people to have a particular price, except it is within the food basket items that we mentioned. So we are saying, therefore, that there are other things that the consumer must guard against, and he has to be educated if he's going to succeed in doing this. Also, businesses will be required to honor warranty cards within the package of items. In the event that the good is defective, the merchant is responsible for sending this item back to the manufacturer, if needs be, as they are acting as a middleman between the manufacturer and the consumer. And Queely made mention of that earlier. We may be trading, for example, with another country within the market, within the sphere of CARICOM. And a guy, a merchant here, imports some goods from another person in the market, it's defective. The consumer realizes that it is defective. He brings it back. He has to be given back his money. You, the person who sold and who bought from that producer in the market, you're responsible to get your money back from that person in the market. And that is why it is so important that the idea was to have a harmonized piece of legislation so that we can operate within our own sphere of the Caribbean region, within the Caribbean region, and thus make doing business more effective for the benefit of all of our people.
We've been speaking a lot about goods, but what about services? I know, Dr. Douglas, during your presentation in Parliament, you referred to, and let me just check it here, it's the to prohibit the inclusion of unconscionable terms in contracts for the sale and supply of goods and services to consumers. So talk to us, Mr. Quilly. Of course, Ms. Rollins, you can jump in as well too, in terms of the services and how it is covered in the new Consumer Protection Bill.
Well, in terms of services, they would still fall under like misleading and deceptive conduct, which is basically unconscionable terms. You cannot express to a consumer that you're going to be offering X and you give them A. If you say you're going to provide a service to this consumer, it should be completed within a specified time frame. The item will be made of a certain standard of ingredients or whatever. You have to honor what it is you say you're going to give to the consumer. And if you step outside of that, it falls under, as I said, misleading and deceptive conduct, and there is a penalty for that under the legislation.
I want to bring it home a bit in terms of local producers, local suppliers. Now, as we speak about labeling, the Bureau of Standards, which of course is also under your remit, Dr. Douglas, how is it working with the Department of Consumer Affairs to ensure that suppliers or producers or whoever they may be engaging with, that they are up to the standard that is required by this new law?
Right. We've spent quite a bit of time and money providing training of the officers of the Bureau of Standards. Because you see, if at all St. Kitts and Nevis is going to really advance within the marketplace and can have reliable products that are made here, circulating in the marketplace, we have to have standards. And we've spent quite a bit of time and money, not only this government, before as well, to establish the Bureau so that it becomes an internationally properly accredited Bureau, so that there is reliability on what it does. And so we have spent quite a bit of time in the Bureau, working, for example, with agro-processors here in St. Kitts and Nevis. And we are trying to get them in par with international labeling requirements of their goods. Simple as it is, the water that is produced here in St. Kitts and Nevis, our water must be able to compete with any other water around the Caribbean region. And we can say our water is reliable, it is safe, because our Bureau of Standards has said it is reliable, it is safe, because it is now internationally recognized as one that can speak to reliability and safety in the marketplace. We also have been making sure that they would be ready for export, not just consumption here in the domestic market, but export within the entire Caribbean region. And that is why, to a large extent, as I said, the Bureau of Standards become very, very, very critical. I want to emphasize that there is a labeling committee that has been established a few years ago. And this was to facilitate this specific purpose for our producers to voice their specific concerns about proposed labeling standards of goods that we provide here in St. Kitts and Nevis. And so the Bureau of Standards has been a major and leading partner with regard to consumer protection, working in tandem with the consumer protection services that we have, especially coming from the Consumer Affairs Department. They work hand in hand.
In the drafting of this bill, how much input did businesses, suppliers have in terms of the details?
Well, we started the process in 2014, I think, and we had a wide range of input from stakeholders. Part of the process was to distribute the bill to small shop owners of small shops, supermarkets, persons working at the Port Zante area, a whole host of stakeholders. And the idea here was to get input on what really jumped out at them in the legislation, if they had any issues with what was contained within the document. We did presentations at the Chamber of Industry and Commerce, and they were involved from the get-go in the process of finalizing the document. So we took on board any suggestions that they may have had at the time, and it resulted in what we have today.
So very quickly, can you detail some of the protection that is offered to suppliers under this legislation?
Well, the bill does not really speak to the protection of suppliers outright like that. But what I would say is the mechanisms that are in place to protect consumers, meaning not having expired items on your shelf, that is one thing that would stick out at me right now, because it protects the business owner as well. Because if somebody purchases an item from your establishment and they end up in the hospital, and let's say they die, you, as the person who sold that item to them and it was expired, would be at fault. So you open yourself up to litigation, maybe not from us at the department, but a civil case. So you're being protected as well by us coming into your department, to your establishment and removing these items. Even though you might receive a fine, you're still being protected in that way of not being sued from a consumer or their family later down the road from ingesting something that is harmful to them.
Because I suppose, there's those who would have a perfect, well, I shouldn't say perfect, that's perfect, it's subjective, of course, and hard to achieve. But those who have a good track record in terms of removing and being up to date with the legislation, being ensured that expired products are, they're removed from the shelf. That, it's human error. Sometimes that someone may miss something actually. And so it does help to protect them in that regard.
That is what we hear all the time from our consultations with the businesses. Somebody might have missed something, it could have slipped through the cracks. But if you're going to be having 3 and 4 cartloads of expired items, that's not slipping through the cracks. That's just being negligent.
And so the range of penalties now outlined in this new legislation, what are they?
The penalties range from $750 to $2,000 for ticketable offenses. Now, when we first started working on this document, these fines were very high, and we had to really sit down and look at what was actually practical. So for ticketable offenses, it is $750 to $2,000. And the other offenses that would be regulated by the board span from $2,000 to $5,000. Right?
What would be regulated by the board? What is the determination that it would need to move from, that would warrant the attention of the Consumer Affairs Board, and which is a new board as well too. And we want to discuss that with Dr. Less a bit after this comment by Mr. Quealy.
Well, the department would function or focus mainly on minor infractions, as I said. Prices not being on the shelf. You don't want to refund a customer for an item that is clearly defective. Expired items, if you don't want to honor warranties. When it comes to larger cases, such as like you may go to a dentist and you have a sort of issue with the dentist, we do not have the expertise in-house to actually remedy that sort of claim. Normally, we would have told the person they would have to seek legal advice. With the board in place, the board would be able to request experts to look at the case and assist them in making a determination on the matter. So when it comes to those sort of level of cases, that is where the board would actually come in. And the department actually functions as an investigative group, authority, for the board. We collect the information related to cases, we investigate them. If it could be resolved in-house, it would be resolved at the department level. If it is something of a serious nature that we cannot be resolved just like that, that is when it would be elevated to the board. The board would take a look at it, determine if they need outside assistance, as I mentioned, and come to a determination on the matter. When the board comes to a determination on the matter, it is up to the defendant if they want to challenge it. And then we would have to go to a further step where it would need the establishment of a tribunal. Because as the minister mentioned earlier, the department is supposed to function as a quasi-court for consumer protection issues. So all matters would be handled inside the department, you could say. Instead of actually having to step outside and go to the court, persons may not have funds to get a lawyer to go to the court. And part of the good governance agenda is protecting the most vulnerable in society. So that is what we're doing here.
Okay. Dr. Douglas, Senior Minister, it was mentioned, as Mr. Quilly just said, a quasi-court. And it's a term that you also use in Parliament for the Consumer Protection Board. How many members will sit on this board?
Right. The membership, not more than 5 persons.
How will they be chosen?
Right. They will be chosen by the minister, of course, with guidelines from the legislation that would have been provided. And of course, I'm sure the cabinet would also make its input. Because, you see, this is significantly and very, very far-reaching board. That's one of the fact that you mentioned quasi-judicial body. That's why one of the specific stipulations from the legislation is that the board shall consist, must, and it must have persons who are knowledgeable and experienced in industry matters. Also persons who are knowledgeable and experienced in commerce. There must be a lawyer who should not have less than 7 years of practice, relatively experienced person. And should have another person who has knowledge and experience in public administration. And also, it stipulates that another person who is to be on the board must have knowledge and experience in consumer protection. And so we believe that with these guidelines, we should be able to have a functional board. The previous legislation spoke to a board. It never functioned because it was never in place. This board will be in place, trust me, and it will function.
Will it be a mix of public and private sector?
That, of course, is important for us. We do not anticipate that all members would come from the public sector, neither from the private sector. It has to be mixed. Because remember what we said in Parliament. We are looking for fairness and balance and trust. It is no longer a situation where we are saying from the old legislation, you must do this, you must do that. Price control can't be that. No. It's a liberalized market of trading that we're doing here. And we would expect that the government, which has spent so much money by giving concessions, etc., to the private sector in different areas, especially manufacturing, that we would be able, at the end of the day, to rely on them as our business and development partners. So it has to be a mix between those from the private sector and public sector. And again, emphasizing the responsibility of the government to this legislation is to ensure that we can do business better with each other.
So there was also discussion in Parliament of where the matters may have to be referred to, the right is there to have maybe a criminal case or a civil case based on the consumers. That would be their decision.
Yes.
Can you tell us how that would work?
Well, I think based on the offense, as Queenie would have indicated, if one sees, for example, that this is a repetitive action on the part of the offender, also, depending on what has happened, there are some. I use the example of Maris in the Parliament. Well, that in itself is a criminal act, isn't it? Producing illegal rum. That is criminal. And so there are certain offenses which already are within the scope of criminality according to existing laws. And so those are matters, of course, which will take criminal course. But the idea is not to criminalize anyone. It is just to create an environment where we are saying that the provider of the service, the provider of the goods, must also take into consideration when he's looking at his profits that there has to be fairness, there has to be people's health being protected, and that is what Consumer Affairs Department is here to do, to ensure that there's fairness and there's balance and there's justice.
And persons who are selling products, they should also be aware that once you gain consumer confidence in your establishment, persons are going to be willing to spend their money with you. So you should always be aware of that and do what is right.
So there are a lot of new initiatives, new legislation, new rights, and as we established before, and Minister, you would have said it, of course, in Parliament, and Mr. Quilly, when you were here before, we spoke about having the teeth to enforce the legislation. So this provides the teeth to enforce the legislation. So then the question is, with all of these new protections in place and all of these new rights that consumers have and the officers are now more empowered, what else is the government going to do in terms of educating the public on these rights, on these new powers and the rule, and also businesses, of course, so because they need to know how the new operation will be, what their rights are as well. What public education campaign will be there?
I'll let Ms. Rollins answer this question, as she is the communications officer and the specialist in this area.
Okay, so we plan on ramping up our public awareness drive. With the passing of this new law, we have key objectives. The first one is to educate consumers about their rights and responsibilities under this new piece of legislation. The second one is to provide guidance to businesses on their duties and responsibilities to ensure compliance with the new legislation. And then thirdly, we want to raise awareness about the consequences of non-compliance, including fines and penalties for businesses. So we want consumers to know their rights and be able to protect their rights. We want businesses to thrive with compliance, and we want to build trust in the marketplace. And we're going to be doing this through various platforms. So Facebook is our main platform right now, because like Mr. Queely would have mentioned, we are in the process of building out a new website for the department and a new app. This will probably come in 2024. So until then, we are utilizing the platforms that we have available to us, which is Facebook, and then we will be going on air like radio appearances to speak more about the law, to speak to the consumers. Right now, we are in collaboration with SBDC, that's the Small Business Development Center. I hope I said that correctly. They are hosting town hall meetings every month, and we have been invited to speak to the small business owners. So we use that as an opportunity to go out and educate the public. Mr. Quealy also mentioned that we were in collaboration with the Tourism Authority. They hosted some business sensitization with all ports and retailers, which was fantastic because we had a turnout of at least 50 people daily for an entire week, and it was the business owners and their staff. So we were able to use that time to properly educate them on the upcoming law, because it was upcoming at that time. This was like 2 weeks ago. So now that it is passed, they can't say that they don't know the information. So we are hoping to continue this. So we'll be out there more in the public, putting out more information. We'll be putting out like brochures, trying to put them in like heavy trafficked places like the supermarkets and stuff like that, where people can grab the information and read it for themselves. So we're going to ramp up our public awareness campaign and hopefully educate and get the businesses ready for when we are able to ticket them. And like I said, we are not just out there trying to ticket them and trying to make money for the government. The overarching goal of this is compliance.
And health and safety.
Public health and safety.
And also elevating the standard of doing business in St. Kitts.
That is so true, because that's what the Tourism Authority business sensitization was about. Tourism being our main industry. If we have businesses being unethical, they stand a big chance that tourists won't want to come to St. Kitts. So it is important that we have these sessions with them and try to ask them to be ethical in their business practices, and if they are not, they will be ticketed or fined.
Right. All the dots must connect. We're out of time for this program, but Senior Minister, I'll give you quickly, just you can say any final words that you'd like to share.
Right. I want to thank you, of course, and thank the not only the director and the communication officer, but the entire staff of Consumer Affairs Protection. We want to say that apart from this piece of legislation, what else can we do to ensure that there is consumer protection? What can the government do? We promise two things. One, we will be looking at the introduction of the competition policy legislation. So this is only one of three things that we will do. The second that is still to be done is looking at legislation regarding price gouging. Mr. Quealy has already researched what is happening in the United States of America, has provided me with some of those pieces of legislation. We will be looking at them at Cabinet, finally, AG Chambers, and we shall come back to you to ensure that our consumers are well protected.
And we look forward to you coming back here on InFocus to tell us about that, Dr. Douglas.
Of course, if ZIZ wants me up here.
Well, this is an SKNIS program.
SKNIS,
yes, and we're also a syndicated show, so we are on different stations as well. So, but we'll leave it there for now. Dr. Douglas, Paul Quealy, and Teresa Rollins from the Ministry of Consumer Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of InFocus.
Thank you.
We'd like to thank you, viewers and listeners, also for being with us. We'd like to encourage you to join us next week at the same place, same time for another edition of InFocus. I'm Ian Richards.
Join us every Wednesday for InFocus, a weekly talk show produced by the St. Kitts Nevis Information Service, where we provide exclusives with key persons within the government and discuss pertinent, relevant, and interesting matters that affect us all. Tune in every Wednesday, live on ZIZ Radio and streamed live on Facebook at SKNIS Media and ZIZ Online. InFocus, your government, your business.